Analysis of Bram Stoker's Dracula Chapter 25. Just a reminder that at any point you can push pause, rewind, etc. If I speak too quickly or if there's something you don't understand, do feel free to go back and listen to it over and over until you do. So what happens in Chapter 25? Well, we're coming towards the end of the novel, and the men promise to kill Mina if it becomes necessary. Unfortunately, their plan to ambush Dracula in Varna fails because he's gone to Galatz instead. Van Helsing and Seward suspect Mina has warned Dracula, even if she only did it subconsciously. And Van Helsing used Mina's connection to Dracula to help them. Please make sure you have read the chapter before you go through this. I will be doing a lot of skipping and only highlighting certain things, and again I would expect you to spend some time going through the remainder of the chapter and identifying features, themes, anything relating to the idea of sleep, hypnosis, etc. So chapter 25 starts with Dr. Seward's journal. Okay, it's dated the 11th of October. And of course, Seward notices that Mina is more carefree at sunrise and sunset, which is of course obvious, as we know that Dracula, this is the time where he is transforming from one entity to another. So this chapter is dominated by a sense of foreboding. They discuss Mina's death, and this discussion and the parties' vow to destroy her creates quite a funereal atmosphere, which I think is further intensified by the very solemn burial rites. It's all very, very macabre, and in keeping with the Gothic genre. Mina is very pleased to be accompanying the men and makes them repeat her promise that they will kill her if she begins to change and begins to become vampiric. And of course, all of them swear to do this. We see that Quincy was the first to rise after the pause. So Quincy is a man of action. He's also a man of modern weaponry, for example, the Winchester rifles being the case in point. He shoots first and asks questions later. Again, remember when he saw the bat. And he doesn't beat around the bush. Remember, he's the only one who voiced the obvious question about what removed so much blood from Lucy Westenra. He's also the first to speak after Van Helsing asked for the men's permission to visit Lucy's tomb and open her coffin. And even though he does, remember, he admitted that he didn't quite see his drift, he also said, though, but I swear he's honest and that's good enough for me. And here in chapter 27, again, he is the first to swear that he will kill Mina. Should the time ever come, I shall not flinch from the duty that you've set us. So although not a particularly well-developed character, Quincy remains steadfast and true to his character. He is always the man of action. He is always the first to commit to doing or to being involved in action. Mina asks Van Helsing to promise that Jonathan will be the one to kill her. She reminds them that she could change very, very suddenly, and of course she wants them to be prepared. And we're going to look at the whole idea of Jonathan and his role in all of this towards the end of the novel. She also makes a very what seems to be a very unusual request. She wants, before she dies, she actually wants to hear her husband read the burial service for the dead. And although it's strange, they all take comfort in this. Now the question is, why does Mina want this? Well, she fears obviously that she's going to change very quickly and therefore will have no chance or opportunity to have the burial rites said over her. And of course, being a person of faith, she believes that this is important in order for her to go to heaven. So she's almost having it done. She's having it done in advance, just in case something happens. But it does tend to add to the macabre scene, and it is quite depressing and dark at this point in the novel. We then move on to Jonathan Harker's journal, and it's 4 days later when they arrive in Varna. They've come via the Orient Express, and Mina is hypnotized, and she says she can still hear water lapping up against the side of a ship. In Varna, she is hypnotized again on the 16th of October. She's hypnotized again, but nothing has changed. Van Helsing actually wants them to board the ship, or Dracula's ship, as soon as he docks in Varna, because if they board the ship before the coffins are removed, they'll be able to trap him, because if you recall, vampires are unable to cross running water, and of course with the tides, the sea is certainly running water. On the 17th of October, Jonathan notes that Van Helsing has managed to get the permission for the group to board Dracula's ship as soon as it arrives. And of course, again, the idea is that if this comes to pass, then it will make eliminating their foe a lot easier. We then have a spate of telegrams. Please remember that this is an epistolary novel, so it is based on letters, telegrams, journals, and it's intended to add to the authenticity of the narrative. Remember, we need to believe that these characters actually experienced these events. We need to forget that it is just a novel, and we need to believe that it actually happens. Just to let you know that they miss getting the ship, and they get a telegram that the Tsarina Catherine has reported this morning from the... We then have Dr. Seward's diary, which of course is dated the 25th of October, and he describes Mina and her behavior and her reactions, and he says how he's very worried about her because she's got this lethargy, she's very tired, and we the reader remember that this is very reminiscent of what has happened to Lucy. And they go on to talk about, in fact, he says, euthanasia is an excellent and comforting word. I'm grateful to whoever invented it. Now, euthanasia would have been a very shocking notion for a Victorian audience, because in their belief system, only God gets to decide who lives and who dies. However, in this case, euthanasia is a very euphemistic word, because of course it's disguising the fact that if Mina turns, the men will have to murder her. So in a way, they are also by using the term euthanasia, they're able to justify their actions. The worst, I think, thinking about considering what they have to do as murder, would probably stop them from doing it. So giving it this euphemistic term maybe makes it easier for them to deal with the idea. Then you notice that the pace of the narrative goes 25th of October, 26th of October, 27th of October, and then it seems to stall. The characters are waiting for the arrival of Dracula's ship. It's very anticlimactic, yet Van Helsing is the only one who appears to be terribly anxious and fear that maybe Dracula is escaping them. I think what we need to look at here is that it's a little odd that Van Helsing, who spent a great deal of time and energy expounding on Dracula's skills in the previous chapter and stating how he doesn't underestimate him, does not seem to realize when the fog comes over, he seems to have forgotten the significance of the fog. And of course, because he seems to have forgotten, despite his previous expounding on the issue, is what manages, which allows Dracula at this point to keep one step ahead. Okay. However, on the 28th of October, they receive a telegram that Dracula is arriving in Gulolz. And they realize, obviously, that they've been waiting for a ship in Varna. They've been hoping to board it, and they realize once more that he has escaped their ambush. So this will be a second time. And Seward says, I suppose that nature works on such a hopeful basis that we believe against ourselves that things will be as they ought to be, not as we should know that they will be. So Seward seems to see life here as a bit of a puzzle. He's getting very frustrated because he is a man of science, yet at this time, science doesn't seem to give him the answers that he wants or needs. He certainly had to do a lot of changing and developing in his thinking as this novel has progressed. If you remember back to chapter 15, his quote-unquote sheer anger at the fact that Van Helsing announces or reveals that Lucy's not really dead, and he obviously fears that perhaps that Van Helsing is, if you remember, quote-unquote unhinged, or he even says quote-unquote off his head. And I think it's quite ironic, of course, that this is a scientist who deals with mental illness, but when he describes his mentor as possibly losing the plot, he uses adjectives like unhinged or phrases like off his head, which is very unscientific. I think there's also irony in the fact that Seward uses physiognomy. Remember when we talked about that, it's about the Victorian idea of judging people's personality traits based on the shape of their head. And I mean, this is supposedly a man of science, yet when he meets Jonathan, if you recall, he wonders if he can quote unquote judge from his face that he is quote uncommonly clever unquote and quote full of energy unquote. So we have this man who is in theory the scientist, but at the same time throughout the text has demonstrated a reliance on the unscientific for explanations. Yet here he is finding it very frustrating that science cannot give him a solution. I think what's also interesting about Seward as a character is that, yes, he's obviously a very observant individual, and he's got a great deal of knowledge, but he doubts his senses and his intuition. It is at this point where I again remind you that, of course, Seward is a character construct. He's not a real person, and Stoker has, in fact, created him to be this way. And if you recall, he mistook, right at the beginning, he mistook the missing, Lucy's missing crucifix as a result of a maid's greed. And he only, he mistook it for devotion. And also, if you recall, he takes a long time to work out the significance of Renfield and his madness. Obviously, he suspects that Renfield is in contact with Dracula, but he doesn't share it with anyone. So it's like he doesn't join the dots, and he doesn't help the others join the dots. And he also keeps Renfield locked in the asylum, which we can see as a reader is a mistake. Perhaps Renfield would have managed to survive had he been released. He also excludes Mina from the hunt, which I think we look at as in retrospect as another mistake, because of course she's left behind and Dracula is able to attack her. I think he has a very traditional role in his mind. He has very traditional roles for both men and women, and of course he worries that Mina will get scared and that this fear will overwhelm her. But to be fair, I think if you look at Mina's character, she's probably far more resilient than Seward as a character. So just to let you know, straight after that quote, he talks about transcendentalism, which is a belief in the supernatural. And he says it's a beacon to the angels, even if it be a will-o'-the-wisp to man. A will-o'-the-wisp is obviously linked to, it's an example of intertextuality, linked to William Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. His character Puck, the fairy, is also known as will-o'-the-wisp. And it's the idea that anything that a will-o'-the-wisp is something that misleads or vanishes. So again, often associated with marshes or marshland and mists and strange light, and recalls to the reader's mind the blue light that we and the blue flame that we read about in Jonathan's journal in chapter 1 to 3. At this point as well, we realize that Dracula's latest escape is met with varying reaction. Of course, Van Helsing is particularly anxious. Lord Godalming grew very pale. I was stunned. Quincy tightened his belt. And interestingly, they all seem to be momentarily paralyzed by the news. And it takes the Harkers to galvanize them back into action and get them back on track. So again, we realize the significance of the Harkers. And in fact, Van Helsing goes on to describe her as a wonderful woman, even though he is concerned about her continuing connection with Dracula. He believes, obviously, that even though she's weak and she's lethargic, that Dracula's managed to latch onto her. And of course, because of this, he's managed to work out what their plan is, and obviously eliminate or escape their trap. And Van Helsing is concerned that Dracula realizes that they plan to annihilate or eliminate him, although I'm not sure it would take Dracula that much to work it out, since they are after him with weaponry, crucifixes, and communion wafers. So at this point in the text, however, Mina's obviously free and healthy, and she and Van Helsing both put their heads together and use their knowledge of criminology to deduce that the Count is a criminal and of a criminal type. And they believe that because of this, because of the fact that he is of a criminal mind and criminal type, that his main purpose will obviously be to escape his pursuers. I don't think you need to be necessarily criminal in order to run away from those who are after you, intent on killing you. But nevertheless, The Ugly Duck and Hans Andersen is just another example of intertextuality. The Ugly Duckling, I'm sure you all know the story of that, who turns out to be a swan, was written by the author Hans Christian Andersen, who was also Dutch. So again, the idea that it's an example of intertextuality, again showing that Stoker is well read and would also appeal to the audience because it would be something they recognized. Finally, Mina and Van Helsing realize that they are headed home. I mean, that the Count is headed home, sorry, and that Mina's not entirely under his or the Count's control. So they decide that they can use her to get to the Count. Again, this is very long and drawn out, and as a modern reader, we're starting to get a little bit frustrated by this, because the idea is, you know, this is all being rehashed. We know this as a reader. We've worked this out. This is ground that the characters have been over and over and over, and they don't seem to be moving forward. Again, it's a reminder that to a Victorian audience, it was traditional that the Victorian novel would drag the ending out, and if you are of a class who has not been given the opportunity to learn to read, and you go to a reading of this, and the person who reads it is extremely dramatic, of course the last thing the audience would want is for the story to end. And I think this would also, we need to bear that in mind when we look at this protracted ending. Back in terms of the criminal behavior, Mina and Van Helsing have a very lengthy discussion about that criminal behavior and how criminals revert to routine and habit when under stress. Again, I would like to stress from a modern perspective, and for those of you who study psychology, I don't think this is just, don't think it's fair to say this only is only the behavior of criminals. Obviously, they work out that Dracula is likely to put self-preservation above all else, and because they manage to think all of this through, they come to realize that, of course, Mina's not obviously completely susceptible to Dracula's control, and that now that he has managed to use Mina to avoid this trap, perhaps he has no more use for her. Again, remember, this is a construct and a story, and there are flaws, because the implication, therefore, is that Dracula thinks their plans are thwarted and he will escape, and that perhaps they won't take another chance. Obviously, during their discussion, Van Helsing is surreptitiously taking Mina's pulse, again, trying very hard to see to what extent the connection is being made. The idea that it is very, very slow, and despite all the excitement, gives Van Helsing hope. He is pleased with her pulse. As we move on towards the end of the chapter, we find it says that terrible baptism of blood which he gave you makes you free to go to him in spirit, as you have as yet done in your times of freedom, when the sun rise and set. At such times you go by my volition and not by his. So what this means is that Van Helsing plans to turn Dracula's control to their advantage. Instead of Mina aiding Dracula, they will now send her to him in order for her to eavesdrop, in a way, on his plans. Again, notice the use of religious language and talking about baptism and spirit. Remember, baptism is an initiation ceremony in the Christian church that involves water and cleanses the initiate. But of course, in Dracula's case, it doesn't involve water, it involves blood. And it doesn't necessarily cleanse the initiate in the traditional sense of the word. Rather, it initiates an individual into the life of vampirism.